Welcome everyone to the APEC-Canada Growing Business Partnerships Capstone Conference. By way of introduction, my name is Alicia Clancy, and I'm presently the Regional Economic Advisor with Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada in the Pacific region. Also, the previous Program Manager for the partnership, and I have the pleasure to be your moderator for today's panel, Lessons from the Field, Research and Collaboration with MSMEs. Since 2016, the APEC-Canada Growing Business Partnership worked to build the capacity of MSMEs through research, training, mentorship, and events with the goal of fostering sustainable inclusive growth and poverty reduction. I had the opportunity and the privilege to oversee field research with partners in Indonesia, the Philippines, Viet Nam, and Peru, and see the creation of original research papers, surveys of MSMEs and entrepreneurs, training and policy workshops, and a mentorship program for women entrepreneurs. Without this important research, the partnership would not be possible, and we're lucky today to have panelists with us that led a lot of this work. The format of today's panel will be a moderated discussion. Our goal is to reflect on the lessons from the field and how they improve research and collaboration. For all the viewers out there, we also want you to be part of the discussion. We invite you to participate in the discussion by using the chat function. Please send us your questions through the chat box and we'll respond in the Q&A portion of this panel. So I'm going to move on and introduce our speakers. Each of our speakers today have vast experience in their respective fields. Also, their full bios can be found below. I would like to provide a brief welcome to our panelists. Dr. Elizabeth Newton, founder of Newton & Company, Carmel Larino, founder of Calzada Coffee, Kevin Chang, founder of Kai Analytics, and Carl Black, Chief Investment Officer at Deakin Impact. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to get started with our first question. I'd like to ask each panelist to briefly introduce the work that they completed with the partnership and comment on the value added to their findings of completing field research with MSMEs and entrepreneurs. I'm going to start off with Dr. Elizabeth Newton. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alicia. So along with my team, which was Jonathan Berkowitz, Alex Mann, and Charlie Shee, we were lucky to focus on young entrepreneurs, 135 from Canada, Indonesia, Peru, Philippines, and Viet Nam, all under the age of 30. And our focus was, number one, what can we do to help them to be more successful in building high-tech startups? And number two, how do we help build bonds between them across the Pacific? We were also lucky to interview 25 investors and 26 startup mentors. So being out in the field, first of all, gave us context-rich data, which there was no way we could get from our Canadian desks far away. And also through the active startup network, we were able to find young entrepreneurs, both aspiring and active, whom we would have never found with a more scattershot approach from Canada. And being in the field really allowed us to follow trails, to learn more about their day-to-day lives and concerns, and also to probe them about their day-to-day issues across culture, and also talk to investors and mentors about what were their interests, their turnoffs, and decision-making processes.
Thank you so much. And we're going to move on to Carmel.
Hi, everyone. I got to work with Kai, who's on this call, and Scott, the blockchain project with Yave. And by working on this research, Calzada was able to focus on an area that we wanted to deep dive into, but didn't have the resources nor the capacity to do so on our own. It was valuable to have Kai and Scott and the support of Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada in order to kind of step back and assess where the business was and reflect on the data and work to see where our constraints were, as well as find opportunities that were in our blind spot. With that said, it was a real challenge for myself, especially juggling research, data collection, all of Kai's questions, and other things that still needed to be done, and running a small enterprise, right? So it's like bottom line, monthly reporting, handling clients, handling farmers. So it was test in multitasking in many forms. That's what I would say I learned having started a business and doing research at the same time for this project.
Wonderful. We'll move on to Kai.
Thanks, Carmel. Yeah, for sure. I won't forget the time where Scott and I and Carmel were in the hotel room, minutes before our presentation, hammering out minute details of our slide. It was definitely a fun experience. But our project at the time with Scott at Yave focused on developing a deeper understanding of blockchain technology and how it can be applied to the agricultural supply chain, in this case, coffee, to make it more transparent and equitable for all the participants. So our original goal is to be able to trace coffee from a bag, like the fresh bag, from farm to cup. In my company, Kai Analytics, we provided the data and field research and explored how we can implement that technology with Yave and Calzada. One of our key findings from the project was that having fully traceable coffee, which we could fetch 40% higher crop prices. And my work with Yave, from the Philippines, also ended up culminating in Guatemala, where we were able to host the world's first coffee blockchain auction. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we'll move on to Carl.
Yes, hi everyone. So my study, I think, was part of the last leg of the APEC-Canada Growing Business Partnership in Peru. And my study was focused on access to finance challenges for, in particular, social enterprises. But I also covered a little bit of entrepreneurship more generally. And of course, not just trying to understand the challenges in terms of access to finance, but also trying to identify solutions that might help alleviate some of those access to finance issues. The research was motivated. I did the research in 2019, and it was motivated by already existing survey data. So for example, there was a survey of Peruvian entrepreneurs in 2018 that found that when asked, Peruvian entrepreneurs cited access to finance most frequently. So 70% of entrepreneurs cited access to finance as a key challenge for their businesses. And similarly, and maybe even more concerning, when asked about causes of business failure, 40% of Peruvian entrepreneurs identified access to finance or lack thereof as a leading cause of business failure. In terms of the thematic content, if you will, of the study, and this really emerged out of the interviews themselves, one of the things I found was that a lot of social enterprises in particular, and by social enterprises, I mean enterprises that use typically market-oriented approaches to solving social or environmental challenges in vulnerable communities. And those enterprises, I found, tended to have investment or finance from impact investment funds, often international impact investment funds, but also locally based, more so than local banks, for example, or other local financial institutions. So that ended up, that theme of impact investing ended up being a theme woven throughout the study as well. In terms of value add, so the core methodology of the study was oriented around semi-structured interviews. And so I did over 50 interviews with entrepreneurs, with investors, and with other entrepreneurship ecosystem players, academics and networks and so on. And what I was trying to do with that is really to try to complement the existing survey data, but also to try to understand it a little bit better, find the story behind that data, obviously filling previously existing data gaps, particularly as they related to social entrepreneurship. Very little previous work on that subset of entrepreneurs in Peru, and ultimately trying to inform or perhaps make a modest contribution to a bottom-up policy conversation, providing a platform for entrepreneurs to connect with policymakers throughout the study, and including right through to events like this, which I think do a really good job of providing that platform and opportunity to interact and share ideas and look for solutions collaboratively to, I think, a very widespread and identified issue in terms of finance for entrepreneurs.
Thank you, and thank you all for your insights on the question. I think a big theme that came up a lot throughout all the comments was context, was providing that on the ground context, being able to have access to voices that you might not get through certain data collection methods and so on. Also, I found it interesting, the business insights side of things as well, being able to partner with somebody doing data collection and figuring out that there's some really good insights in there for business growth as well. That being said, a lot of these projects need very strong on the ground partners. I just wanted everyone to touch on the importance of those partnerships in the economies that they've worked in for this project and for other projects doing field research. For this one, I think we will start with Carl. Sorry, you just finished, but.
No problem, yeah. So as I mentioned, I did a number of interviews for my study. I also did a couple of detailed case studies, one with a technical institute in the outskirts of Arequipa in a place called Yura, in what's called the Cono Norte, or the northern cone of the area, and a second case study with a company just in the southern part of Peru in a place called Puno on the Lake Titicaca. And obviously doing those case studies and connecting with 50 interviewees required a heavy reliance on local partners in order to connect with the right people. And I live in Peru, so I was able to do a lot of this face-to-face, which I think was really helpful as well, including site visits for the two case studies. But I just wanted to maybe use a few examples of partnerships in the context of my study to illustrate a little bit my answer and the fundamental nature of partnerships to the success of the study. So you mentioned off the top that I work with an impact asset management firm called Viet Nam. And so we've been working in Peru for over 10 years, probably 10 to 15 years. And so we already had some established relationships and including with a cooperative called ABACO, through which I was able to get access to an interesting number of social enterprises, including those outside of Lima, as well as in different parts of Lima. And they also provide interesting access to different members of the financial community in Peru, including what are called municipally owned cooperatives, essentially, or CMACs for short in Peru. So that's one example of an important partner for me in terms of accessing interviewees. Maybe just two more examples. Kunan, who I know participated in a panel yesterday. It's a social entrepreneurship platform that was founded in 2014. I know Cynthia participated yesterday as well, but they were really integral as well in terms of giving me access or facilitating access to very interesting social entrepreneurs that were willing to participate in the interviews. And I know more broadly for the Peru leg of the study, Kunan was a very important partner for the project as a whole. And then thirdly, and getting back to this idea of partners outside of Lima, I had a previous existing relationship with Caja Arequipa, which is the municipally owned cooperative based in Arequipa, which is the second largest city in Peru, in the southern part of Peru. And so I had known them through the Global Alliance for Banking on Values. And they actually facilitated access to one of the case study participants. And as I say, it was really important for me to avoid the study that I did from being Lima centric, Lima representing about a third of the population of Peru, but I really wanted to broaden the study to touch all regions of Peru. And so Caja Arequipa helped, of course, in the southern part of Peru. Abaco helped quite a bit in the northwest, in around Chiclayo and other parts of northwestern Peru. And then I also got access to participants, for example, in the northeast, in the jungle in Iquitos. Maybe just a final couple of points, maybe more general points in terms of best practices in terms of doing field research. So as those examples illustrate, I think finding and working through influential leaders and organizations, absolutely fundamental in the case of my project. And then maybe a more general comment, going into the field and being open-minded as opposed to kind of bringing preconceived ideas and notions into the interviews. And actually I think the methodology, semi-structured interviews, so having interviews that have some structured aspects that allow me to quantify results a little bit more easily, but also a more free-flowing conversation aspect allowed those new ideas to come through a little bit, and definitely got answers I think I would not have gotten had I had gone in with sort of just a straight survey, which again, I think there's value in surveys and value in more open-ended discussions, and the two complement each other. But I found being really open to hearing what entrepreneurs, investors, and other ecosystem participants were saying was a key best practice in the case of my study.
Thank you so much, Carl. I'm going to move on to Elizabeth after that.
Great, thank you. So in terms of the importance of on the ground research, I would say incredibly important. So number one is in terms of credibility. So having local partners, they added both credibility and also cultural context. So obviously within our own cultures, we have our own cultural biases and habits that can skew both the way we ask and interpret questions. So for instance, in recent research, I had a question related to pride. How proud are you about X? And a cultural partner told me, within this culture, pride is actually not seen as a positive thing. So a small example of how these cultural partners can help. In our research, the whole focus was on how do you strengthen these cross-Pacific entrepreneurial partnerships. So certainly that's something we had to actually model in our own research. Also, I find in the startup world, there's such openness to share and to give back, and these strings go across the ocean. So for instance, on our research team, we had Charlie Shee, who was at the time a bright young entrepreneur working in the virtual reality space. It was through his youthful startup network that we met another researcher in the Philippines in their startup network. And he was able to find people that we would never have been able to find, to lure them to come to talk to us and to get some really in-depth questions. So credibility, context, and connections.
Thank you so much. I'll move on to Carmel and Kai can kind of do this one together since they were partners, but Carmel, you can start if you'd like.
Sure, ladies first, right? So yeah, in terms of this question, I think building that partnership with Yave, I first had met the co-founder, Scott Tepper, when he was still building his coffee brand, Onda Origins. Since we're both from Seattle, I would run into him and bump into him in various coffee shops and coffee events. So prior to even starting this research, we had this sort of built relationship. And as I was building Calzada and going back and forth from the Philippines, I was inspired by brands like Onda, who had a similar vision in terms of creating a shared value in terms of revenue streams, and then building relationships across all actors in the coffee value chain. And as Onda was tackling from the roasting and consumer markets, we at Calzada were tackling it and coming from the porch at farm approach from the farm level. And so when Scott mentioned to my co-founder, we met at a coffee shop, this new project he was working on called Yave, it really piqued our interest, as blockchain was a way for us to kind of combine our shared interests. And it was new at the time, and we thought it would be a great opportunity to test out some of these challenges and improve in providing transparency to both farmers and consumers. It was a way for us to really test out our group experiences and see if we could possibly create the transparency we wanted in the supply chain that was a major part of our mission and vision. And lastly, I think it was an easy partnership at the get-go, as we already had that built relationship, as I shared with Scott, and quickly Kai as well. They knew already the coffee industry and the various stakeholders. And I think this built relationship and in all aspects with regards to research and partnership is a great way to build trust and collaboration. And it felt less extractive, right? Because it's sort of you need to go out on the field to extract some data, because there was already this this collaboration, and Calzada is deeply embedded in the community. We also wanted to make sure whoever we brought into the community had that understanding, and that they respected those relationships.
Go ahead.
Going last in this question, I run the risk of plagiarizing all the other panelists, because you touched on very important points. And I think, yeah, and I have to bounce off of Carl and Elizabeth that, the local partners are highly critical to the success of your field research. I come from a, economist background, but now I focus a lot on qualitative research. And so when it comes to surveying people, have to be aware of the cultural context, and having that local partner being able to critically evaluate your instrument can really kind of help identify, the proper ways to engage with the community and to collaborate together. One of our key successes on the project was being able to survey the participant of the whole coffee supply chain in the Philippines. So on the farm, to the processors, to exporters, to even the cafes, and even the arts community that kind of are part of the cafe environment. Oh, and also public officials as well. And so through Calzada's network, we had a very successful survey through Facebook communities, Facebook groups, in-person interviews at the farm, at the cafe, and even with a leading coffee chain, a CEO of a leading coffee chain in the Philippines, to kind of put all that context together. The other thing too is working with a great partner like Calzada is it's great, especially with Carmel. She's very direct and she can quickly crush many of your assumptions and theories that you come with you from your desk. And so I think for partnerships to be successful also, that there needs to be transparency in the communication and proper diligence on both sides. And I think that was why we were really successful. Let me see, the last point is, yeah, and to bounce off of Carmel, you don't want the research to be extractive, and the partnership must be mutual with a mutual goal in mind. But also a few bottles of San Miguel is also very, very helpful in engaging with the community.
The perfect segue. Thank you. Our third question before we move to the Q&A section is sort of trying to sum up all of the work that we've done and what we want policymakers to take away from it. So at the APEC level, at the national level of the economies that you are working in, if there's a few items that you could list that you want policymakers to hear, this would be the moment. So I'm going to throw it back to Carmel because I know she was quite vocal on some of these for the Philippines. So I'm gonna get her to kick this off.
Sure. I was hoping you'd do Kai, but I'll start. I think at least from my perspective in the social entrepreneur lens, I think we learned, and it's something that Calzada has known, and the reason why we exist in the first place, right? We fill in some of these gaps for the government and policymakers. And so through the research, we found that there were some improvements that these policymakers and government need to do before something like blockchain technology could be implemented in the coffee supply chain in the Philippines. Is, what Kai and Scott had found out, like some of these gaps were because the Philippines is a local industry that's still underdeveloped and facing growth challenges in many areas, right? So it's like, for me, it's basic farm level training, providing quality seedlings. There's still lack of infrastructure and roads, lack of modern production techniques and post-harvesting methods, and the coordination between industry and stakeholders is still very convoluted and a little bit hard to understand as a business owner. And then addressing some of these gaps in collection and distribution of research and technical knowledge is just to name a few aspects before we can actually do some of the things we wanted to do and implement with the blockchain technology that Kai and Scott wanted to do in the Philippines. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Carmel. So yes, to kind of continue that discussion here. So about 2 years ago, when we started the project, it was a really exciting time, and still is for blockchain technology, because at that time it was starting to become more accessible for developers and programmers, and at least in North America. Certain frameworks like Hyperledger, which we were using, supplied by IBM, has really simplified the hosting implementation process. And working with Yave, we had a prototype where we could go to a farm and collect information, data from SMS, like short messages, or even from social media platforms like Facebook Messenger. But so that was all in theory. And so one of the challenges is once we were on the field, One of the big challenges was the lack of a stable and reliable internet infrastructure. So I think, and most of the data center we later learned in the Philippines had to go through Singapore first as well. So there was no actual infrastructure in place at the time. Other geographical regions were difficult, but we did learn that there is very wide adoption of Facebook within the community. So I think that's really important to know for policymakers in terms of communicating and reaching out to the community. And the other finding we found was that there wasn't a strong legal framework around internet technology at the time. And if I recall from our research, their national legislation didn't contain the word internet yet at the time. So that's something I think the policymakers could look into and review. I think one challenge too was the difficulty for SMEs that we spoke with to access federal funding or innovation funding. And in theory, the DTI, which is the innovation and kind of investment arm of the Philippine government, provided funding for SME. They set aside and asked banks to provide that to innovative companies. But in practice, and speaking with Carmel, I think the banks have found out that it was a little bit less risky to pay the penalty for not meeting their quota than to provide these loans to some of these innovative firms. But having said that, I think there's some key takeaways too, that when policymakers are evaluating programs, especially in rural regions, is to look at a lot of the social kind of innovation and social impact that might not be as hard, like hard numbers that show up in certain evaluation criteria. And the story that really kind of, or the experience that really stuck with me was when I first set foot on the farm. It was with one of Carmel's colleagues. She hadn't been back in a couple months, but she made these comments like, "Oh, look, there's a new paved road that wasn't here a few months ago. Oh, there's a new washing machine this auntie has installed." And through our conversation, we learned that, after I believe a few years of partnerships with Calzada, one of the farmer's daughter will be one of the first to enter college. So these are lasting impact that we could see on the field, but may be lost in translation when applying for certain funding with the federal agencies. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. And I'll move on to Elizabeth now.
Great, thank you. So I would say I have 4 main points. Number 1 is untapped potential. So we were delighted to find that there's such a real interest in cross-economy collaborations from the young Canadian entrepreneurs, and even more so from the young entrepreneurs from Indonesia, Peru, the Philippines, and Viet Nam. So what can policymakers do to facilitate that? Number 2, to ease cross-cultural education. So one of the greatest impediments, and I think Kai mentioned this as well, from our young entrepreneurs was a lack of knowledge about their cross-cultural counterparts. So we want to work together, but what don't we know about each other? In what ways are we the same? In what ways are we different? Sometimes they would exaggerate the degree to which they were different when really they were having so many common concerns. Number 3 is some active support for young entrepreneurs. So within and across cultures, access to financing, mentorship, matchmaking young teams with each other, with investors and mentors, making it easier to navigate programs and funding. And then finally, as the last point, cross-cultural entrepreneurial boot camps. So what kind of specific initiatives could policymakers support for carefully vetted pre-seed stage young entrepreneurs?
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. And we'll move on to Carl.
Yeah, so maybe just a couple of general points here. So in terms of, so I guess, as I said, the challenge being access to finance, and that being a widespread, widely cited challenge. What I tried to do is understand where is that challenge targeted in the Peruvian context. And so, I mean, clearly the local financial institutions are financing something, and usually relatively mature companies that have several years at least, or many, many years of track record, profitable, relatively low debt relative to the total assets, and so on, able to tell a compelling backward-looking story that aligns well with what typically tends to be backward-looking credit analysis by established financial institutions, and also in a position to provide guarantees that banks and other financial institutions typically look for. At the other end of the spectrum, there is some, it's relatively nascent, I would say, in Peru, but there is some finance from the public sector for startups, for new enterprises, new business ideas that aren't necessarily proven in the market yet. There's an initiative called Startup Peru, for example. There's also initiatives at universities in the country. And those, and Kunan has, for example, a prize that they award annually, an annual challenge that provides a little bit of funding to startups. So there's a certain amount of activity when it comes to startups. And then what I found is that, and I'd be curious to know if others who did studies in the 3 Asian economies found the same, but that the missing, it's often called the missing middle in the literature, but the missing bit is where you have companies that are actually already have proven business models in terms of they've proven there's a market for their product or their service, and they're looking to scale. They don't have the backward looking story in terms of healthy operating margins necessarily, and 3-5 years of audited financial statements and so on. And yet they think there's an opportunity to scale, often innovative, often compelling businesses, either in country or regionally. And there's not a lot of finance for that segment. And so that seems to be where the challenge is. And I think, you know, there's a compelling story to be told about the potential impact of financing those types of businesses from a public policy perspective. And so when I think about the role, potential role of public policy and public financing mechanisms, for example, I thought about it in the context of trying to ultimately crowd in private investment, sort of kickstart businesses to get them to the point that they're sufficiently attractive for private impact investors or other perhaps more risk-sensitive investors. And well, I had quite a lengthy discussion in my report on a few different ideas and areas, but I thought maybe I would just mention what the 3 broad recommendations were from the study, and hopefully there's an opportunity to talk about a few examples in the Q&A. But basically what I recommend is that the public sector in Peru look to bolster support for the development of and promotion of viable social enterprises. And a lot of these recommendations you could probably more broadly apply to startups and other types of SMEs as well. The second was to consider fiscal policy incentives to promote social entrepreneurship. And the third, which is where I spent most of the time in terms of discussion and more detail in the study, was on creating new public sector funding mechanisms for social enterprises. And I know there's, for example, just to finish on this, one initiative by the Development Bank of Peru called COFIDE that's looking at creating a fund of funds. And so providing funding to funds to then invest in certain types of businesses. The focus in Peru has been on technology and innovation, as perhaps it has in other countries as well. But there's some hope that there might be an impact investment angle to at least one of the funds that the fund of funds invest into. But that's an example, and we'll see that actually the pandemic seems to have slowed down a little bit the implementation of that, which was announced some time ago. It'll be interesting to follow where that goes, but those types of public commitments to funding fund administrators or funds themselves to then on lend, I think is an interesting thing to explore a little bit further. And well, perhaps will be an opportunity to discuss some of those ideas in more detail here in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Carl. I'm not sure if anybody wanted to respond to that they found similar things in their work to Carl. Yeah. So at this stage, I think I'm going to go to the Q&A and answer one of the questions live. We have a question that says, I was wondering if you could talk about the importance of field research and on-the-ground partnerships to address issues of inclusivity in the MSME entrepreneurship space, such as gender equality. Do we have any takers? Elizabeth, do you want to start?
Sounds like school. Do you have any takers, Elizabeth, or whomever? I mean, I would say a lot of that is like a lot of the inclusivity questions comes down to where's the power. So first of all, the power in asking the question. So are you including the people who, be it gender representation, be it ethnic representation, age representation, are they there in forming the question? Because if we narrow the question to what we think is important and we research that, then we may end up sort of getting a self-fulfilling answer that doesn't help the people who need to be helped. And then to the other end of the equation, in terms of, well, in the middle, the power in terms of selecting who's going to be asked. And then most importantly, the power of implementation. So are the people who are not being represented there at the end stage when things are actually being implemented and influential decisions being made? So that's how I'd start on that.
Do we have any other comments on the question?
I can contribute to it, I hope. When we do our field research too, the first thing I look for is, I start internally and making sure the team I put together for the research is also has the diversity and the representation to do the research as well. So I know for my team as well, current team, there's I tried my best for gender balance and more importantly to have background in different languages, just so we can handle a lot of different cultural contexts and help bounce ideas off each other. And one of the recent challenges we faced with this too is just kind of, again, working with a local partner to understand the context. When we did a separate survey in the past year, we wanted to make sure there's gender balance in our, or gender representativeness in our survey. But part of the survey required phone interviews. And when you do household calls, sometimes in some cultures, it's the male of the house that would always answer the phone. So you'll run into a problem with getting representative responses. And so we would have to supplement that with, doing more creative approaches, having people at the supermarket, waiting outside of the churches on Sunday, just to make sure we cover the different demographics.
Yeah, I mentioned a little bit before about inclusivity from a regional perspective in Peru, but I thought maybe I'd complement that with maybe an example, not from a field research perspective necessarily, but as investors, we're often doing very detailed due diligence on specific companies, which at the end of the day, maybe isn't all that different from doing a detailed case study, as part of a study like the one like the ones we've all been talking about. And just from a gender inclusivity perspective, we have a fund that's focused on women's empowerment and is focused on looking at businesses through a gender lens. And so we found is that over the years, the businesses that have more diversity in decision making at the board level, at management level, and at mid-management level as well, are more successful. And so we've incorporated that directly into our investment criteria, and also look at things like gender disaggregation in data. So what data do the businesses have at their fingertips in terms of driving their decision making, including product and service creation and tailoring to meet the differentiated needs of different types of people, men, women, and other differences among people. And so I just wanted to mention that it's a little bit of a metaphor almost for what was being asked about in terms of field research, but I thought it might be a relevant thing to add.
I'll just say a little bit. I'm not a researcher per se. I'm on the ground and one of the entrepreneurs, female entrepreneurs. But I think in terms of also funding, right? Like I think researchers also are in need of funding, and sometimes this funding is like there's a season for different types of goals, and I think now we're getting folks asking us to be partners in the lens of technology and innovation. And I think gender and women equality was a hot topic last year, and we got a lot 2 years ago, starting 2 years ago. So I feel like it's also in the funder that's asking for researchers that gender inequality needs to always be part of the funding, and so that there's always going to be a continued growth in trying to understand what is the link or what is the gaps, because researchers need money in order to do some of this research, and sometimes funders have a different goal or thrust depending on what might be new and hot in terms of what to fund. So I think for me on the ground, I'm experiencing different folks wanting to do research or partner with us, but as always, sometimes a different lens, right? So if it's wanting to do gender and women empowerment, I think we need to always have that as part of funding.
I would just jump in finally, and finally for myself anyway, say that I would also then look at outcomes. So presumably, hopefully, the research that we're doing is having some impact. And so is this having a proportional impact on women, for instance? And if not, then moving backwards to make sure what can we do differently next time to make sure that it's more equally impactful in the future.
Thank you so much for that, Elizabeth. This came up a lot for us when we were running the project, in that we were doing our best to measure impact and measure it to show that we were doing things with a gendered lens on what we were trying to accomplish. And we found that difficult beyond, a head count. We needed to show long-term impact and sustainability. And so I'm going to sort of hijack the Q&A and just ask you all to talk a little bit about some of the sustainability you've seen in your work over time, and just impacts, and feel free to share success stories or stories of people you've worked with. I don't know if anybody wants to start, kick us off. Okay, I'm going to pick Carl then.
Yes, well, maybe one thing that hops to mind for me is I think there's a little bit of momentum in Peru, in particular around the topic, I suppose, of my study, which was again financing, or access to financing, and around the theme of impact investing in particular. So actually, we at Dietken, I was a little bit involved, but I didn't lead this work. But between June 2020 and April 2021, did another study on impact investment ecosystems in Peru, and I know the study that study drew on the work that had been done as part of the APEC-Canada Growing Business Partnership in Peru, but it had different elements. I mean, one element was about creating an ecosystem map that placed the key players in the impact investing ecosystem where they belong. And there was a dynamic map and a static map, and an effort to find local champions to carry the updating of that on an ongoing basis going forward to make that particular effort sustainable. There was also, as part of that work, education and collaboration strategy that was developed around the theme of impact investment, and trying to educate broadly stakeholders on the topic through workshops and meetings. And then lastly, there's an effort to create a national advisory board in Peru to carry this forward with the key stakeholders in the country to continue to bring forward the issue of impact investing as a potential solution through public funding mechanisms or otherwise, or just a matter of attracting and promoting and thereby attracting investment to the viable social enterprises that are already impact aligned in Peru. And so I wanted to mention that. I thought that was a direct follow-on. Also had public sector funding from Canada, and I know Canada's committed to staying engaged in Peru, and I imagine in some of the other countries that other panelists represent as well, in terms of carrying forward the work that's been done as part of this program.
Elizabeth, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the long-term sustainability in your work?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one thing I found very interesting, particularly in this work, is the startup and community loves new ideas, loves potential. So the sparks that were planted by the research itself. So, since doing the research, I've had some of the investors and mentors say, what's happening with those cross-cultural, collaborations, and entrepreneurs saying, well, how could I get involved in these entrepreneurial teams? So often in academia and beyond, we think of research as this block and then it's over, but we've planted these seeds. How do we now get maybe some of those people involved to start building on some of the things that they themselves have helped us unearth?
Thank you so much. I'm gonna get maybe Kai to talk about the growth of some of the work that you've done.
Yeah, so directly from the project, for me, it's always important to kind of return the results of the work to the people that we interviewed or participated. So immediately after the survey, when the results were tabulated, we were able to kind of send the results of the survey to all the people who participated in the interview and in the survey project, to kind of let them know this is the result of our finding, where the challenges are, and help facilitate that discussion. And then again, once the full report was published. And in terms of like the learning experiences from this, I've carried that on forward. And a lot of the work we do now too is to assist other researchers, other organizations that collect a lot of qualitative information. And we do help them kind of measure that, extract themes from their text, and then help them frame their outcomes or their strategic goals a little bit better and more effectively.
Thank you so much. I don't know, Carmel, if you want to talk about the growth of Calzada, or if we can also, we have a Q&A question, so it's up to you.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay, so the next Q&A question that's come up starts with a compliment, which is always great. All of you have such fascinating research projects with a lot of in-depth context into each of your local environments. What are some of your future research projects you are currently working on, and what future topics do you think would be interesting to cover on MSMEs growth given the global pandemic? Any volunteers? Okay, Kai.
Thank you. Wait, I volunteer first and I forgot the question. Let me what I'm already working on. Over the past couple of years, we've been specializing in a field of science called natural language processing, which is the analysis of unstructured text. And I've kind of been leveraging it and applying this technology to education and international development, and more recently focused on climate adaptation. So one part of our work is now kind of launching this application so other researchers can use it. The other part is to kind of, I'm very interested in kind of understanding more of the inequalities that are brought about climate adaptation, especially what I've learned recently in the context of Africa and other kind of developing, lesser developed countries, because there's a lot of inequality and awareness of how the climate adaptation has affected a lot of the communities.
Thank you. Carl, do you want to talk about some of your possible future projects
Yes.
or what's going on?
Yes. Can you hear me okay? It cut out, it seemed like, for a second there, but I think you can hear me. Yes, I mean, my day-to-day work is as a chief investment officer for 2 renewable energy funds, but as Beacon Impact, we invest in 3 different things predominantly. So in renewable energy or sustainable energy, in social entrepreneurship, and in inclusive finance. And a cross-cutting theme across all of those is women's empowerment and gender equality. And so what we try to do with research projects like this one and others is try to be thought leaders in the areas where we're investing. And so one of the things that we're looking at, well, on a continual basis, is how best to measure the social and environmental impact of our investments. and doing that in a collaborative way, and often sharing our ideas publicly and looking to improve in that way through collaboration. So that's an area of thought leadership, I would say, that I hope to be involved in, and Deakin more broadly would be involved in. And maybe just a second example is something we're looking at more and more is how to integrate into the renewable energy sector from an investor's perspective, women's empowerment and gender equality. So there's some evidence out there that women, for example, tend to have more jobs in the renewable energy sector than in the traditional fossil fuels based energy sector. But from everything I've seen, there's a lot of work to do there. And we're keen to continue to investigate that further through formal research projects, but also just in our day-to-day interactions, conferences, through networking, reading the news and so on. So we're constantly trying to be thought leaders, say in those two areas in particular, and continue to look for opportunities to contribute through research opportunities as well, including the one I mentioned previously on the impact investing ecosystem in Peru. We tend to be very focused on Latin America and the Caribbean so far. We'll see what we have in store and what I have in store personally as the years go by, but that seems to be probably the focus for the next, say, 5 years at least.
Elizabeth, do you have anything to add about current research or future research?
Yeah, we'll talk future. The question I mentioned, the pandemic. So the psychologist in me is always very interested in how has this pandemic changed? It's all changed us. How has it changed us all? How has it changed us similarly and differently across the economies? And how might that change our entrepreneurial motivations? And also we have Zoom, we have all of this. How can this help facilitate building some of these cross-Pacific entrepreneurial teams? Economically, across the cultures, we've all been impacted very differently. So how is that impacting people's willingness to take entrepreneurial risks, investors, mentors, et cetera? So I guess how has this all changed us, and how can we use this to help leverage a stronger cross-Pacific startup community?
Carmel, I'm not sure if you want to talk about how you had to pivot during COVID-19.
Sure. Yeah, no, I can also answer a little bit that's very industry specific to the first part of the question. In terms of research on the ground in the coffee industry and Calzada specifically, we do have grant funding from external funders that do more of the community-based aspects of what we do on the ground. So what we are currently working on for this next harvest season is we have all this data collected from our 175, 180 farmers we work with and how much coffee they sell to Calzada. And we're now going to track their thirst for risk in terms of re-evaluating their land and where they grow coffee, which are all kind of old growth currently and not as productive. So how many of their farmers are open to cutting down some of these trees and starting from scratch, knowing that there's a market already existing in their community, and what is their thirst for doing that risk? Because farmers are, hand to mouth, and so they don't really see this long-term need to invest in their land if they're trying to feed their family. So we're onboarding 10 this season to do like kind of this long-term trajectory, and then paying them the money that they would have earned in this plot of portion of their land, because we have 7 years of data of how much coffee they were producing, so we can offer this grant and in the form of a lending through an external funder, so that they can rejuvenate and hopefully in 3 to 5 years have it be more profitable. And in terms of research for MSMEs, I think what would be interesting to tackle during this time is like how we have innovated, maybe pivoted in terms of where we sit in the global pandemic. And at times I think about the advances in technology that we had to do given the restrictive nature of like me, I can't go up to the farms, or even like aspects that the government needed to have, face-to-face meetings that now can exist. They are now answering via email, which didn't happen before, and how this can actually be, quicker to handle export licenses and all of these stuff that used to be, pain points, like major pain points for industries in developing countries like the Philippines, right? So I think it would be interesting to see how much gap has actually been shortened because of the pandemic, right? So there's access now to cashless transactions and smaller ways to do that, which there wasn't before, or it existed, but no one ever used it because they were used to the old ways, right? But now it's forced everyone to do so. So I think that would be interesting to see as research.
Thank you all so much. That was a really great silver lining to everything, Carmel. Thanks. Export licensing moving faster is always a win. So at this point, I think I'm going to have to wrap up. I think we're getting pretty close to time, but I want to thank all our panelists for their generosity and for taking the time out of their busy schedule to speak with all of us today. And I also want to thank the audience for asking questions and for engaging in our discussion. It's really been a pleasure to be able to work with all of you. And a couple of years ago when I had the role, and so it was really great. I also want to thank the partnership's funder, the Government of Canada, for recognizing the importance of these topics and for enabling this conference to take place. Over the past 2 days, speakers from across 4 panels have shared their priorities for inclusive growth, the importance of women and youth entrepreneurship, ways to streamline policy implementation and development, and sharing lessons from the field like we did today. It's been a pleasure to moderate the final session of this conference, which has nicely summarized many of the discussions that have taken place over the past 2 days. So I just wanted to let everyone know that the following panel after this is the closing keynote with Ms. Norleila Suhaili, the chair of the APEC Small and Medium Enterprise Working Group. So I hope everyone is able to join us for that. And after the closing keynote, there's even more. There's a formal networking session to allow everyone a chance to engage with panelists, exhibitor booths, speakers, and conference participants. So I hope everyone can join us. And thank you all once again. And thank you to all of the staff that made this conference possible.